Sometimes life throws you a curveball so unexpected that it completely changes who you are as a person. For most of us, finding strangers on our property would be cause for alarm, maybe even a call to the police. But what happens when those strangers turn out to be a desperate family with nowhere else to go? What happens when your simple act of checking on some unusual sound in your barn leads to a discovery that will test everything you believe about compassion, community, and what it truly means to be human? This is the story of how one man's ordinary Tuesday morning became the catalyst for something extraordinary. It's about the moment when doing the right thing costs you everything you thought you wanted and gives you everything you never knew you needed. It's about how sometimes the greatest discoveries happen not when we're looking for treasure, but when we're simply listening to our hearts. What would you do if you found 8 souls seeking shelter in your barn? Would you turn them away, or would you make a choice that would shock an entire town and change multiple lives forever? Marcus Thompson had always been a creature of habit. Every morning at 6:30 sharp, he would step out onto the porch of his farmhouse with a steaming cup of coffee and survey his 50 acres of land. The ritual had become sacred to him over the past 15 years since he'd inherited the property from his grandfather. The rolling hills of Cedar Valley stretched out before him, dotted with oak trees and crossed by a lazy creek that provided water for his small herd of cattle. That Tuesday morning in late October started like any other. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter. Marcus pulled his flannel shirt tighter around his shoulders as he walked the familiar path toward the red barn that stood about 200 yards from the house. His boots crunched softly on the gravel driveway, and somewhere in the distance, a crow called to its mate. Marcus had planned to check on the hay bales he'd stored for the coming winter months. The local weather forecast predicted an early freeze, and he wanted to make sure his cattle would have enough feed. As the town's only large animal veterinarian, he understood the importance of preparation. His neighbors often joked that Marcus was the kind of man who had backup plans for his backup plans. As he approached the barn, something felt different. The large wooden doors, which he always kept securely latched, were slightly ajar. Marcus frowned, running through the previous evening in his mind. He was certain he had locked up properly after feeding the cattle. Perhaps the wind had blown them open, though the heavy iron latch was designed to prevent exactly that. He paused for a moment, listening. From inside the barn came soft sounds that didn't belong to any farm animal he knew. There was a gentle murmuring, almost like whispered conversations. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Living alone on a property this size, he had always been cautious about security, though Cedar Valley was the kind of place where people still left their front doors unlocked. Quietly, Marcus approached the barn doors and peered through the gap. What he saw inside stopped him cold. Huddled together in the corner near the haystack were 8 figures. A woman, clearly injured based on the way she was favoring her left side, sat propped against a hay bale. Around her were 7 children of various ages, from what appeared to be a teenager down to a toddler who couldn't have been more than 3 years old. They were all dirty and obviously exhausted. Their clothes were torn and stained, and even from his position by the door, Marcus could see that they hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. The woman's face was pale, and there was a makeshift bandage wrapped around her arm that was spotted with dried blood. The children were trying to stay quiet, but Marcus could hear the soft whimpers of the youngest one, who was pressed close against the woman's side. The teenager, a boy with dark hair that hung in his eyes, kept glancing toward the barn doors as if expecting danger to walk through at any moment. Marcus stood frozen, his mind racing. Who were these people? How had they ended up in his barn? The woman looked like she was in serious need of medical attention, and all of them appeared to be suffering from exposure and hunger. His first instinct was to call the police. After all, these were strangers on his property, and he had no idea what circumstances had brought them here. But something about the scene stopped him from reaching for his phone. Perhaps it was the protective way the older children were positioned around younger ones, or the obvious care they were showing for the injured woman. These weren't dangerous criminals. They were a family in desperate need of help. Marcus took a step back from the barn doors and leaned against the wooden fence that surrounded his property. His grandfather's words echoed in his memory from countless conversations they'd had during his childhood visits to the farm. "Son, the measure of a man isn't what he has, but what he's willing to give up for others who have less." The old man had been a pillar of the Cedar Valley community, known for his generosity and his willingness to help anyone in need. During the Great Depression, he had fed countless families from his garden, and never asked for anything in return. Marcus had always tried to live up to that legacy, but he'd never faced a situation quite like this. He thought about his comfortable life in the farmhouse. At 42, he had never married, content with his veterinary practice and his quiet existence on the farm. He had everything he needed and most of what he wanted. His savings account was healthy, his property was paid off, and he enjoyed a respected position in the community. But looking at the family in his barn, Marcus realized that his comfortable life suddenly felt very small. Here were people who had nothing, not even a safe place to sleep. Whatever had brought them to his property in the middle of the night, they were clearly running from something or someone. Marcus made his decision. Instead of calling the authorities, he would approach them directly. If they were dangerous, he could always retreat and call for help. But his instincts told him that these were simply people in trouble who needed assistance. He pushed open the barn door slowly, making sure to announce his presence so he wouldn't startle them. "Hello," he said softly. "I'm Marcus. This is my property." The reaction was immediate. The teenager jumped to his feet, positioning himself between Marcus and the rest of the family. The woman struggled to sit up straighter despite her obvious pain, and the younger children pressed closer together. "Please," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're not here to cause trouble. We just needed somewhere safe to spend the night." Marcus could see fear in her eyes, but also a fierce determination to protect the children with her. Her accent was slight, but noticeable, suggesting she might not be from the area. "Are you hurt?" Marcus asked, nodding toward her bandaged arm. The woman hesitated before nodding slightly. "It's not serious," she said, though the pallor of her skin suggested otherwise. Marcus looked at the children, noting their hollow cheeks and the way they were huddled together for warmth. The youngest one, a little girl with tangled blonde hair, was shivering despite being wrapped in what appeared to be someone's jacket. "When did you last eat?" Marcus asked. Again, the woman hesitated. The teenager answered for her. 2 days ago," he said, his voice defiant but scared. "But we're not asking for charity." Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. 2 days without food. A woman with an untreated injury. 7 children sleeping in a barn in October, weather that dipped into the 30s at night. Whatever pride or caution he'd been holding on to suddenly seemed very unimportant. "My name is Marcus Thompson," he said again, this time sitting down on a nearby hay bale to make himself seem less intimidating. "I'm a veterinarian, which means I know a little about treating injuries. I also know that you can't have come this far with that arm injury without being in significant pain." The woman's composure cracked slightly. "I'm Elena," she said quietly. "These are my children." Marcus looked at the 7 young faces staring back at him. Even in their fear and exhaustion, he could see the family resemblance. They all had the same dark eyes and strong jawlines. "Elena," Marcus said carefully, "I don't know what brought you here, and I'm not going to ask unless you want to tell me. But I do know that you need help, and I'm in a position to provide it." "We can't pay you," Elena said quickly. "I'm not asking you to," Marcus replied. "I'm asking you to let me help." The silence that followed was heavy with uncertainty. Marcus could almost see Elena weighing her options, trying to decide whether this stranger could be trusted. The children looked to her for guidance, their faces reflecting their exhaustion and hunger. Finally, Elena spoke. "Why would you want to help us?" It was a fair question, and Marcus took a moment to consider his answer. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "And because my grandfather taught me that we're all just one bad day away from needing help ourselves." The teenager stepped forward slightly. "What kind of help?" he asked suspiciously. Marcus looked at each of them in turn. "Food first. Medical attention for your mother's injury. A warm place to sleep. And time to figure out what comes next." "You don't even know us," Elena said, confusion clear in her voice. "No," Marcus agreed. "But I know enough. I know you're a mother who's been taking care of 7 children on your own. I know you're all hungry and scared and hurt. I know you ended up sleeping in a barn because you had nowhere else to go. That's enough for me to know that you deserve help." Elena's eyes filled with tears, though she tried to blink them away. "People don't just help strangers anymore," she said. "Maybe not," Marcus said, "but people should." He stood up slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. "The house has hot water and a kitchen full of food. There are bedrooms with warm beds. There's a first aid kit that I can use to properly treat that injury." He paused. "The only question is whether you'll let me help you." The little girl who had been shivering looked up at Elena with wide, hopeful eyes. Marcus could see the exact moment when Elena's maternal instincts overrode her caution. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, yes. Thank you." As Marcus led the family of 8 from his barn to his farmhouse, he had no idea that this simple act of kindness was about to turn his quiet life completely upside down. He didn't know that within hours, news of his unexpected house guest would spread through Cedar Valley like wildfire. He couldn't have predicted that his decision to help a family in need would make him the center of a controversy that would divide his community and test everything he believed about right and wrong. All Marcus knew in that moment was that 8 people who had been sleeping in his barn were about to have warm beds and full bellies. And for now, that felt like enough. Inside the warmth of Marcus's farmhouse kitchen, the transformation was immediate. The family that had appeared so desperate and frightened in the barn began to show signs of relief as the heat from the wood stove thawed their chilled bones. Marcus moved efficiently around his kitchen, setting out bread, cold cuts, cheese, and fruit while coffee brewed on the counter. The children sat around his large oak dining table with wide eyes, as if they couldn't quite believe they were safe indoors. The youngest girl, who Elena introduced as Sophia, kept looking toward the windows as though expecting someone to appear and drag them back outside. "It's all right," Marcus said gently as he placed a plate of sandwiches in the center of the table. "You're safe here." Elena had allowed Marcus to examine her injured arm, and what he found concerned him greatly. The wound was deeper than she had let on, clearly infected and in need of proper medical attention. As he cleaned and rebandaged it with supplies from his veterinary kit, she winced but didn't complain. "This needs stitches," Marcus told her quietly. "And antibiotics. I can handle the stitches, but you really should see a doctor for the infection." Elena shook her head firmly. "No doctors," she said. "Please." The fear in her voice told Marcus there was much more to their story than a simple case of a family down on their luck. He decided not to push the issue for now, instead focusing on making them comfortable while he figured out what was really going on. As the children ate ravenously, but politely, Marcus learned their names. There was Miguel, the protective teenager who looked to be about 17. Then came Carmen, a serious 15-year-old girl who kept helping the younger ones with their food. The middle children were twin boys named Diego and David, around 12 years old, followed by 9-year-old Isabella, who seemed to be the family peacemaker. 7-year-old Lucas was quiet and observant, while little Sophia, at just 4 years old, stayed close to her mother's side. "Where are you all from?" Marcus asked as he refilled their glasses with milk. Elena and Miguel exchanged glances before Elena answered. "We've been traveling for a while," she said carefully. Marcus could sense there was much more to the story, but he didn't want to pressure them when they were just beginning to feel safe. Instead, he focused on practical matters. "Well, you'll need places to sleep tonight. I have 4 bedrooms upstairs. It's not fancy, but the beds are comfortable and there are plenty of blankets." "We don't want to impose," Elena said quickly. "We can manage in the barn." "Absolutely not," Marcus replied firmly. "It's supposed to drop below freezing tonight. Besides, you need to rest properly so that arm can heal." After the meal, Marcus showed them around the house. His grandfather had built it to accommodate a large family, with spacious bedrooms and 2 full bathrooms. The children were amazed by simple things like hot running water and electric lights that worked with the flip of a switch. As evening settled over the farm, Marcus found himself sitting on his front porch with Elena while the children explored their temporary bedrooms upstairs. The sounds of their voices, excited and happy for the first time since he'd met them, drifted down through the windows. "They sound like normal kids when they're not scared," Marcus observed. Elena smiled for the first time since he'd found them. "They're normal kids. They deserve normal lives." "But they haven't had normal lives lately," Marcus said gently. Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening landscape. Finally, she began to speak. "We lived in Phoenix," she said. "I was married to a man named Roberto, the children's father." Her voice grew soft. "Roberto worked construction, good steady work. We had a nice house in a safe neighborhood. The kids were in good schools." Marcus waited, sensing she needed to tell the story at her own pace. "Roberto got involved with the wrong people," Elena continued. "At first, it seemed innocent enough. Just some guys from work who needed help with side jobs. Extra money, you know? But it wasn't construction work." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Drug dealers?" he asked quietly. Elena nodded. Roberto said he was just moving packages, that he wasn't selling anything. He said it was temporary, just until we got caught up on bills. But you don't just quit that kind of work when you decide you've had enough. She pulled her injured arm closer to her body, a reflexive protective gesture. Roberto tried to get out. He told him he was done, that he wanted to go back to legitimate work. They said fine, but first he had to do one last job. A big one. Elena's voice broke slightly. He said no, so they made an example of him. Marcus's stomach turned. They killed him 3 months ago, Elena confirmed. Shot him in our driveway, while the children watched from the living room window. The weight of that revelation settled between them like a stone. Marcus tried to imagine the trauma those children had experienced, watching their father murdered in front of their home. The police couldn't protect us, Elena continued. Or wouldn't. They said Roberto had made his choice, and now he had to live with the consequences. They offered to put us in witness protection if I could testify against the men who killed him, but I didn't know enough to be useful. And even if I did, she gestured toward the house where her children were settling in for the night. I couldn't risk their lives for the chance at justice. So we left. In the middle of the night, we just left everything and started driving. How long have you been on the road? Marcus asked. 7 weeks, Elena said. We've been staying in shelters when we could find space, sleeping in the car when we couldn't. I had some money saved, but it doesn't go far when you're feeding 7 children and buying gas. Marcus was beginning to understand the desperation that had driven them to sleep in his barn. How did you end up here specifically? The car broke down about 5 miles from your property. We walked until we found somewhere that looked safe to spend the night. I saw your barn and thought maybe we could rest there until morning, then figure out what to do next. What were you planning to do? Elena shrugged helplessly. Keep moving, I guess. Try to find a place where we could start over. Somewhere far enough away that Roberto's former associates would never think to look for us. Marcus looked at this woman who had been carrying such an enormous burden on her own. 7 children to protect. An injury that was making it hard for her to function. No money, no permanent shelter, and the constant fear that the people who killed her husband might come looking for witnesses to silence. Elena, he said carefully, what if you didn't have to keep running? She looked at him with confusion. What do you mean? I mean, what if you could stop here? What if this could be the place where you start over? Elena shook her head immediately. We can't impose on your kindness any longer than necessary. You've already done more than enough. What if it wasn't charity? Marcus asked. What if it was something that helped both of us? Elena studied his face in the porch light, trying to understand what he was suggesting. Marcus had been thinking about this since he'd first seen the family in his barn. His property was large enough to need help maintaining. He'd been considering hiring someone to help with the farm work, especially as he got older. And the house was certainly big enough for all of them. I need help running this place, Marcus explained. 50 acres is a lot for one person to manage. I could use someone to help with the livestock, the garden's general maintenance. In exchange, you and the children would have a place to live, food to eat, and safety. Elena stared at him. You're offering us a home? I'm offering us a partnership, Marcus corrected. You'd be earning your place here, not accepting charity. But you don't know us, Elena protested. You have no reason to trust us with your property, your life. Maybe not, Marcus agreed. But I know you're a mother who would do anything to protect her children. I know you're willing to work hard because you've been surviving on your own for months. I know you're honest because you could have stayed hidden in my barn and I never would have known you were there. Elena was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus could see her wrestling with hope and fear. There's something else you should know, she said finally. We're not here legally. Marcus felt his chest tighten. What do you mean? Roberto, and I came here from Mexico 15 years ago. We were supposed to be temporary workers, but we stayed. The children were born here, so they're citizens, but Roberto and I never got our papers straightened out. This changed things, and Marcus knew it. Harboring undocumented immigrants could get him into serious legal trouble. But looking at Elena's face, seeing the shame and fear there, he found that the legal complications seemed less important than the human complications. Are you telling me this so I'll withdraw my offer? He asked. Elena nodded reluctantly. I'm telling you because you have a right to know what you'd be getting involved in. Marcus considered this for a moment. His life had been simple and uncomplicated for 42 years. He'd never had to make difficult moral choices or face situations that challenge his comfortable worldview. But sometimes life forces you to decide who you really are when everything you thought you knew about yourself gets tested. Elena, he said finally. I'm not withdrawing my offer. Her eyes widened. Marcus, if anyone finds out, then we'll deal with that when it happens, Marcus said firmly. Right now, 7 children are sleeping safely in warm beds for the first time in months. Their mother is getting medical care for an infected wound. That matters more to me than paperwork. Elena began to cry, and Marcus realized these are the first tears of relief rather than desperation that she'd probably shed in months. Why? She whispered. Why would you risk everything for us? Marcus thought about his grandfather again, about the stories he'd heard of families helped during hard times, about the legacy of kindness that had been passed down to him. Because, he said simply, it's who I want to be. Neither of them had any idea that their conversation on the front porch had been overheard by Marcus's nearest neighbor, Bill Henderson, who had been walking his dog along the property line and had caught enough of their discussion to understand exactly what was happening. By morning, news of Marcus's unexpected house guest would begin spreading through Cedar Valley, and the simple act of offering shelter to a family in need would become the most controversial decision anyone in town could remember. Marcus woke to the sound of children's laughter echoing through his house, a sound he hadn't heard in these walls for over 20 years. The morning sun streamed through his bedroom window, and for a moment he lay still, listening to the voices downstairs and marveling how different his home felt with a family in it. Elena had been up before dawn, despite his protest that she should rest. When Marcus came downstairs, he found her in the kitchen making breakfast for her children, moving carefully to protect her injured arm, but insisting on taking care of her family herself. You don't have to do this, Marcus told her as she flipped pancakes on his stove. Yes, I do, Elena replied firmly. If we're going to stay, even temporarily, we need to contribute. I won't have my children thinking they can take without giving. The children were already adapting to their new environment with the resilience that kids seem to possess naturally. The twins, Diego and David, were helping Marcus feed the cattle, asking endless questions about farm life. Isabella and Carmen were collecting eggs from the chicken coop, while Lucas shadowed Marcus everywhere, fascinated by the workings of the farm. Little Sophia remained close to her mother, but even she was beginning to show signs of feeling safe. Marcus noticed she had stopped constantly looking toward the windows and doors, no longer expecting danger to appear at any moment. The peaceful morning was interrupted by the sound of vehicles coming up the gravel driveway. Marcus looked out the kitchen window and felt his stomach drop. 3 pickup trucks were approaching the house, and he recognized the lead vehicle as belonging to Bill Henderson, his neighbor. Elena, Marcus said quietly, take the children upstairs. Elena looked out the window and immediately understood. The fear that had been absent from her face all morning returned instantly. Is it them? She whispered. Did they find us? No, Marcus said, though he wasn't entirely sure. I think it's something else. Just take the kids upstairs and stay there until I tell you it's safe. Elena quickly gathered her children and herded them toward the staircase. Miguel, the oldest, hesitated at the bottom of the stairs. Should I stay and help? He asked Marcus. No, Marcus replied. Your job is to protect your family. Go with your mother. As the family disappeared upstairs, Marcus walked out onto his front porch to meet his unexpected visitors. Bill Henderson climbed out of his truck, followed by 2 other men Marcus recognized from town. George Miller owned the hardware store, and Frank Peterson ran the local auto repair shop. Morning, Marcus, Bill called out, but his tone was anything but friendly. Bill, Marcus replied carefully. George, Frank, what brings you out here so early? The 3 men approached the porch, and Marcus could see tension in their posture. Bill Henderson was a man in his 60s who had lived in Cedar Valley his entire life. He was known for his strong opinions and his tendency to speak his mind without much consideration for diplomacy. We need to talk, Bill said. About your house guests. Marcus kept his expression neutral. I'm not sure what you mean. Don't play dumb with us, Marcus, George Miller interjected. Bill heard you talking to that Mexican woman last night. We know what's going on. The casual racism in George's tone made Marcus's jaw tighten, but he forced himself to remain calm. I had some people who needed help, Marcus said evenly. I provided it. Help. Frank Peterson stepped forward. Marcus, you're harboring illegal immigrants. Do you have any idea what kind of trouble that could bring to this town? The only trouble I see is 3 of my neighbors showing up on my property uninvited to tell me who I can and can't help, Marcus replied. Bill Henderson pulled out his cell phone. We're calling immigration control. Those people need to be reported. Put the phone away, Bill, Marcus said, his voice carrying a warning. Like hell I will, Bill replied. These people are criminals, Marcus. They don't belong here. They're human beings who needed help, Marcus said firmly. And this is my property. I'll help whoever I choose to help. Not when it affects the rest of us, George said. You bring illegals into this community, you put all of us at risk. At risk of what? Marcus demanded. Having to show basic human compassion. Frank Peterson stepped closer to the porch. Marcus, be reasonable. These people could be dangerous. You don't know anything about them. I know they're a mother and 7 children who were sleeping in my barn because they had nowhere else to go, Marcus said. I know the mother has an infected wound, and the children haven't eaten properly in days. That's enough for me. It's not enough for us, Bill said, holding up his phone again. I'm making the call. Marcus stepped down from his porch, positioning himself between Bill and his phone. I said put away. The tension in the air was palpable. These were men Marcus had known for years, people he'd considered friends and neighbors. But he was seeing a side of them he'd never witnessed before, and it was deeply troubling. Marcus, George said, trying a different approach, think about your reputation in this town. You're a respected member of this community. Don't throw that away for a bunch of strangers. My reputation? Marcus repeated incredulously. George, if helping people in need damages my reputation, then it's not a reputation worth having. Bill Henderson was growing increasingly frustrated. You're not thinking clearly. These people are using you. They're probably planning to rob you blind and disappear in the night. They've had plenty of opportunity to rob me, Marcus pointed out. Instead, the mother made breakfast for her children this morning, and the older kids are helping with farm chores. Frank tried another angle. What about the law, Marcus? You can't just ignore immigration law because you feel sorry for someone. I'm not ignoring anything, Marcus replied. I'm providing temporary assistance to people in need. Last I checked, that wasn't a crime. Harboring illegal immigrants is a federal crime, Bill said angrily. Helping human beings shouldn't be, Marcus shot back. The argument was getting nowhere, and Marcus could see that his neighbors were becoming more agitated rather than less. He also noticed that Frank Peterson kept glancing toward the house, as if he was looking for signs of Elena and the children. Look, Marcus said, trying to find some middle ground. I understand your concerns. But these people aren't a threat to anyone. Give me some time to help them figure out their next steps. How much time? George asked suspiciously. As much as they need, Marcus replied. That was clearly not the answer his neighbors wanted to hear. Bill Henderson shook his head in disgust. Fine, he said, but don't expect the rest of us to just sit back and watch while you turn Cedar Valley into a sanctuary for criminals. They're not criminals, Marcus said for what felt like the 100th time. They're here illegally, Frank pointed out. That makes them criminals by definition. Marcus felt his patience wearing thin. Being undocumented doesn't make someone a criminal any more than speeding makes you a criminal, Frank. And I'd be willing to bet every one of us has broken our share of laws over the years. That's different, Bill protested. Is it? Marcus challenged. Or is it just different because it's convenient for you to think so? The 3 men exchanged glances, and Marcus could see they were reaching the end of their patience as well. Marcus, George said, his voice carrying a threatening undertone, you might want to reconsider your position. This town has ways of dealing with people who don't want to be good neighbors. Are you threatening me, George? Marcus asked calmly. I'm just saying that actions have consequences, George replied. Your veterinary practice depends on the goodwill of this community. Might be a shame if that goodwill dried up. Marcus felt a cold anger settling in his chest. These men were threatening his livelihood because he had chosen to help a family in need. The small-town values he had always believed in were being revealed as conditional, available only to those who looked and acted in ways the community approved of. Get off my property, Marcus said quietly. What? Bill asked. I said get off my property, Marcus repeated, his voice carrying absolute authority. All of you. Right now. Marcus, don't be stupid about this, Frank tried one last time. The only thing that would be stupid would be listening to another word of this conversation, Marcus replied. You have 10 seconds to get in your trucks and leave. The 3 men realized they had pushed too far. Reluctantly, they began walking back toward their vehicles, but Bill Henderson turned back before getting in his truck. This isn't over, Marcus, he called out. You're making a mistake that's going to cost you everything. Maybe, Marcus replied, but at least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror. As the trucks disappeared down his driveway, Marcus remained standing in his yard, his hands shaking slightly from anger and adrenaline. He had known that his decision to help Elena and her family might be controversial, but he hadn't expected such immediate and vicious opposition from people he had considered friends. From an upstairs window, he could see Elena watching him with worried eyes. He gave her a reassuring wave, though he felt anything but reassured himself. The threats his neighbors had made weren't empty ones. George Miller was right that his veterinary practice depended on the goodwill of the community. If enough people turned against him, he could lose everything he had worked for. But as Marcus looked up at the window where Elena and her children were watching him with grateful, trusting faces, he realized that everything he thought he had worked for suddenly seemed much less important than the choice he was being asked to make between his comfortable life and his fundamental beliefs about right and wrong. The battle lines had been drawn, and Marcus found himself on the side he had chosen rather than the side that would have been easiest. The question now was whether he would be strong enough to stay there when the real pressure began. Within 48 hours, word of Marcus's house guest had spread throughout Cedar Valley like wildfire. The story grew and changed with each telling, becoming more dramatic and controversial with every retelling. By the time it reached the coffee shop on Main Street, some versions had Marcus harboring dozens of undocumented immigrants, while others suggested he was running some kind of criminal enterprise. The reality was far different from the rumors, but reality rarely matters as much as perception in small towns where everyone knows everyone else's business. Marcus discovered this harsh truth when he drove into town for supplies and noticed the stares and whispered conversations that followed him wherever he went. At Peterson's grocery store, conversations stopped abruptly when he entered. Helen Peterson, Frank's wife, watched him with obvious disapproval as he selected items for his expanded household. When he brought his cart to the checkout, she rang up his purchases in silence, her lips pressed together in a thin line of disapproval. "Helen," Marcus said as she bagged his groceries, "how are you doing?" She didn't look up from her work. "Fine," she replied curtly. Marcus had known Helen Peterson for 15 years. She had always been friendly and chatty, asking about his practice and his family. The cold shoulder she was giving him now made it clear that news of his house guest had reached every corner of the community. As Marcus loaded his groceries into his truck, he was approached by Sarah Mitchell, who taught at the local elementary school. Unlike the others, she seemed genuinely concerned rather than hostile. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I heard about what you're doing. I think it's wonderful that you're helping that family." Marcus felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. "Thank you, Sarah. That means a lot. But I have to warn you," Sarah continued, lowering her voice further. "There's a town council meeting tomorrow night. Bill Henderson and some of the others are planning to bring up your situation. They're calling it a public safety issue." Marcus felt his stomach clench. "What kind of public safety issue?" "They're saying that harboring undocumented immigrants could bring federal attention to the town. They're worried about raids, investigations, that sort of thing." Sarah glanced around nervously. "There's also talk about your veterinary license." "What about my license?" "Some people are suggesting that if you're breaking federal law, it could affect your professional standing. They might try to have your license reviewed." Marcus realized that his neighbors weren't just threatening his business. They were threatening his entire career, everything he had worked for since veterinary school. "Sarah," Marcus said carefully, "what would you do if you were in my position?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, clearly struggling with her answer. "I'd like to think I'd do the same thing you're doing," she said finally. "But I have 2 kids of my own to think about. I can't afford to lose my job." It was an honest answer, and Marcus appreciated her candor. Most people weren't willing to admit that their moral convictions had practical limitations. "I understand," Marcus told her, "and I appreciate you warning me about the meeting." As Marcus drove home, he thought about Sarah's words. She supported what he was doing in principle, but couldn't risk her own security to stand up for it publicly. How many other people in Cedar Valley felt the same way? How many of his neighbors privately agreed with his decision, but wouldn't speak up when it mattered? Back at the farm, Elena and her children were settling into a routine that felt increasingly natural. The older children had taken on responsibilities around the property, while Elena, despite her injury, insisted on handling most of the cooking and household tasks. Marcus was amazed at how quickly the house had come alive with their presence. Miguel had shown an aptitude for working with the cattle and had expressed interest in learning more about animal care. Carmen was helping Elena plan a garden for the following spring. The twins were natural mechanics, fascinated by the farm equipment and eager to learn how everything worked. But, despite the growing sense of normalcy, the fear was never far from the surface. Elena started at every unexpected sound, and Marcus noticed that she kept the window blinds drawn and rarely ventured far from the house. "Elena," Marcus said one evening as they sat on the front porch after the children had gone to bed, "we need to talk about tomorrow night." He explained about the town council meeting and the concerns that were being raised about their presence in the community. Elena listened with growing alarm. "Marcus, we should leave," she said when he finished. "We're causing you too much trouble." "You're not causing me trouble," Marcus replied firmly. "Other people's reactions to you being here are causing trouble. That's not the same thing. But if it affects your business, your career, then I'll figure something else out," Marcus said. "Elena, you and your children are safe here for the first time in months. I'm not going to let fear drive you back onto the road." Elena was quiet for a long moment. "In Phoenix, before everything went bad, Roberto and I used to talk about what kind of country we wanted our children to grow up in. We wanted them to live somewhere that judged people by their character rather than their origin." "This can still be that place," Marcus said. "Can it?" Elena asked sadly. "Because from what you've told me about these town meetings and threats, it sounds like the same prejudice we were running from." Marcus didn't have a good answer for that. The ugly reality was that the community he had lived in peacefully for his entire adult life was revealing sides of itself he had never seen before. "Maybe," he said finally, "but maybe there are also people here who believe in doing the right thing. Maybe we just haven't heard from them yet." The next evening, Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of avoiding the town council meeting, he decided to attend. If people were going to discuss his situation, he wanted to be there to speak for himself. The Cedar Valley Community Center was more crowded than Marcus had ever seen it for a town council meeting. Word had clearly spread, and people had come to witness what promised to be a contentious discussion. Marcus walked into the room and took a seat in the back, noting the mixture of hostile stares and curious glances directed his way. He recognized most of the faces, people he had known for years, but the atmosphere felt charged with tension and suspicion. Bill Henderson wasted no time in bringing up what he called the immigration situation. He stood up during the public comment period and addressed the 5-member town council with obvious indignation. "Council members," Bill began, "we have a serious situation developing in our community. Marcus Thompson is currently harboring an unknown number of undocumented immigrants on his property. This creates risks for all of us." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people turned to look at Marcus. He remained seated, listening to Bill's presentation. "These people could be dangerous," Bill continued. "We don't know their backgrounds, their criminal histories, or their intentions. Furthermore, by harboring them, Marcus is committing a federal crime that could bring unwanted government attention to our town." George Miller stood up next. "I want to add that this situation could affect all of our businesses. If word gets out that Cedar Valley is a sanctuary for illegal immigrants, we could face federal investigations, raids, all kinds of problems." Frank Peterson joined in. "We're not heartless people. We understand that Marcus thinks he's helping. But he's putting all of us at risk for the sake of strangers who shouldn't be here in the first place." The council members, all of whom Marcus had known for years, looked uncomfortable with the situation. Chairman Robert Hayes, a retired banker, cleared his throat. "Marcus," he said, "would you like to respond to these concerns?" Marcus stood up slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. He had never been comfortable with public speaking, but he knew this might be his only chance to present his side of the story. "Thank you, Robert," Marcus began. "First, I'd like to correct some misinformation. I'm not harboring an unknown number of people. I'm providing temporary assistance to a mother and her 7 children who found themselves in desperate circumstances." "Illegal immigrants," Bill Henderson interrupted. "Human beings," Marcus replied firmly. "Whatever their documentation status, they are human beings who needed help." He looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as possible. "This family was sleeping in my barn because they had nowhere else to go. The mother was injured, and the children were hungry. I made a choice to help them because I believe that's what decent people do when they encounter suffering." "You're breaking federal law," George Miller called out. "Maybe," Marcus acknowledged, "but I'd rather break a law that criminalizes compassion than break my own moral code by turning away people in need." The room erupted in competing voices, some supporting Marcus and others condemning him. Chairman Hayes called for order. Marcus, he said when quiet was restored, while we appreciate your compassion, you have to understand the position this puts the town in. We can't appear to sanction illegal activity. I'm not asking the town to sanction anything, Marcus replied. I'm asking my neighbors to respect my right to help people on my own property with my own resources. An older woman Marcus didn't recognize stood up in the middle of the room. What about our safety? She demanded. How do we know these people aren't criminals or terrorists? Because they're a mother and 7 children aged 4 to 17 who have been living in poverty for months, Marcus answered. Because I've been living with them for a week, and the biggest threat they pose is that they might ask for seconds at dinner. A few people chuckled at that, but the tension in the room remained high. Pastor Williams from the Methodist Church stood up. Marcus felt a surge of hope, thinking the minister might provide some moral support. I think we need to be very careful here, Pastor Williams said. While we should always be compassionate, we also have to respect the law. The Bible tells us to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Marcus felt that hope deflated. Even the local clergy were taking the safe, legal position rather than the moral one. Pastor, Marcus said, the Bible also tells us to welcome the stranger and care for the vulnerable. Sometimes those two imperatives come into conflict. But we have to be practical, the pastor replied. We can't help anyone if we destroy our community in the process. The meeting continued for another hour, with various community members voicing their concerns and opinions. A few people spoke in support of Marcus, but they were clearly outnumbered by those who wanted Elena and her family removed from the community. Finally, Chairman Hayes called for a vote on a resolution calling upon Marcus to resolve the immigration issue on his property within 10 days. The resolution passed 4-1, with only Councilmember Janet Morrison voting against it. As the meeting ended, Marcus found himself surrounded by people wanting to continue the argument. Some were hostile, others sympathetic but concerned, and a few were genuinely supportive. Janet Morrison, the sole dissenting council member, approached him as the crowd thinned out. Marcus, she said quietly, I want you to know that not everyone in this community has lost their humanity. What you're doing is right, even if it's not popular. Thank you, Janet, Marcus replied. That means more than you know. But you should also know that some of these people aren't going to stop with a resolution. Bill Henderson was talking to some folks after the meeting. They're planning to take this further. Marcus felt a chill. What do you mean? I mean, they're talking about federal authorities, immigration enforcement, maybe even trying to get you arrested. As Marcus drove home that night, he realized that the battle for Elena and her children's safety was just beginning. His community had made it clear that compassion was a luxury they couldn't afford, and that doing the right thing would cost him more than he had ever imagined. But when he pulled into his driveway and saw the warm lights of his house, knowing that 8 people who had been sleeping in his barn were now safe and secure inside, he knew he had made the only choice he could live with. The question now was whether he would be strong enough to keep making that choice when the real consequences began. The federal agents arrived on a cold Thursday morning, exactly 10 days after the town council resolution. Marcus was in the barn checking on a sick calf when he heard the vehicles approaching. Through the small window, he could see 3 black SUVs making their way up his gravel driveway. His heart began racing as he realized this was the moment he had been dreading and preparing for since the town meeting. Someone had followed through on their threat to contact immigration authorities, and now Elena and her children were about to face the very fate they had been running from for months. Marcus ran toward the house, hoping to give Elena and the children some warning, but it was too late. The agents were already out of their vehicles and approaching the front door by the time he reached the yard. Marcus Thompson asked the lead agent, a stern-faced woman in her 40s wearing a dark suit and badge. Yes, Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Agent Sarah Chun, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. We need to speak with you about individuals who may be residing on your property without proper documentation. Marcus's mind raced as he tried to figure out his options. He could deny everything, claim that Elena and her children had already left. But he knew that these agents wouldn't have come without some level of certainty about what they would find. I'd be happy to talk, Marcus said, but I'd like to see a warrant first. Agent Chin held up a folded document. We have a warrant to search the premises for undocumented individuals and any evidence of harboring violations. As Marcus examined the warrant, he could see Elena's face in an upstairs window. She was holding little Sophia, and Her expression showed the terror of someone whose worst nightmare was coming true. The older children appeared at other windows, their faces reflecting confusion and fear. "Marcus," Agent Chun said, following his gaze toward the house, "this will go much easier for everyone if you cooperate with us." "What exactly are you looking for?" Marcus asked, still stalling for time. "We have reports of undocumented individuals living on this property. Specifically, a woman and 7 children who entered the country illegally." Marcus realized there was no point in denying what was obvious. The agents clearly had detailed information about Elena and her family. "They're not criminals," Marcus said quietly. "Immigration violations are federal crimes, Mr. Thompson, and harboring undocumented individuals is also a federal crime that you could be charged with." "They're human beings who needed help," Marcus replied. "I provided it." Agent Chin's expression softened slightly. "Mr. Thompson, I understand your compassion, but we have laws that need to be enforced. These individuals need to be processed through proper channels." Marcus looked up at the windows where Elena and her children were watching this conversation that would determine their fate. He thought about everything they had been through, the violence they had fled, the months of fear and uncertainty. He thought about how they had begun to feel safe for the first time in months, how the children had started to smile again, how Elena had begun to believe that they might actually have a future. "Agent Chun," Marcus said, "what happens to them if you take them?" "They'll be processed according to standard procedures. Given their status, they'll likely face removal proceedings, which means they'll be deported back to Mexico." Marcus felt sick. Elena had told him that returning to Mexico wasn't an option. The people who had killed Roberto had connections there as well, and they would be in just as much danger south of the border as they had been in Phoenix. "And what happens to me?" Marcus asked. "That depends on several factors. The degree of your cooperation, the extent of your involvement, whether this appears to be an isolated incident or part of a pattern." Marcus understood. If he cooperated fully, admitted his wrongdoing, and expressed remorse, he might face minimal consequences. If he continued to resist, the charges could be much more serious. Agent Chin seemed to sense his internal struggle. "Mr. Thompson, I know this is difficult, but these people put you in an impossible position when they came onto your property illegally. You're not responsible for their choices." "Yes, I am," Marcus said firmly. "I'm responsible for my choices, and I chose to help them. Help them by convincing them to surrender voluntarily," Agent Chin urged. "It will be better for everyone if they come willingly." Marcus looked at the house again, knowing that Elena and her children were depending on him to protect them. They had trusted him with their safety, and now he was faced with the choice between his own security and theirs. "Can I talk to them first?" Marcus asked. Agent Chin nodded. 5 minutes. Marcus walked into his house, trailed by 2 agents, and found Elena and her children gathered in the living room. They were holding hands, presenting a united front despite their obvious fear. "What's going to happen?" Elena asked quietly. Marcus knelt down in front of the children, meeting their eyes one by one. "The agents want to take you to a place where they can review your cases. They're going to ask you to come with them." "Are you going to let them take us?" Miguel asked, his teenage bravado cracking to reveal the scared boy underneath. Marcus felt his heart breaking. These children had already endured more trauma than most adults would face in a lifetime. They had watched their father murdered, fled their home in the middle of the night, lived on the road for months, and had just begun to feel safe again. "I don't have the power to stop them," Marcus said honestly. "But I want you to know that no matter what happens, you did nothing wrong. You're good kids with a good mother, and you deserve better than this." Elena's composure finally broke. "Marcus, I'm so sorry. We never meant to bring this trouble to you." "You didn't bring trouble," Marcus said firmly. "You brought joy. You brought life to this house. You reminded me what's really important." Agent Chin appeared in the doorway. "Time's up, Mr. Thompson." Elena stood up slowly, gathering her children around her. "We'll go," she said with quiet dignity. "But please, don't punish Marcus for helping us. He's a good man who did nothing but show kindness to people who needed it." As the family was led outside to the waiting vehicles, Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside him. Watching these children, whom he had come to care about deeply, being taken away against their will crystallized everything he believed about right and wrong. "Agent Chun," Marcus called out before the SUVs departed. "I want to make a statement." The agent turned back to him with surprise. "Mr. Thompson, I went on the record that I don't consider what I did to be a crime. I provided food, shelter, and medical care to human beings who needed help. If that's illegal, then the law is wrong. Agent Chin studied his face. Mr. Thompson, I'd strongly advise you not to make any statements without an attorney present. I don't need an attorney to say what I believe, Marcus replied. Elena Morales and her 7 children are good people who deserve better than what they've received from this country. I helped them because it was the right thing to do, and I would do it again. Mr. Thompson, furthermore, Marcus continued, I want it known that they were not trespassers on my property. They were my invited guests. They were helping me maintain my farm in exchange for room and board. That makes them employees, not criminals. Agent Chin looked at him with something approaching respect. Mr. Thompson, you realize that these statements could be used against you in any potential prosecution? I understand, Marcus said, but some things matter more than potential consequences. As the SUVs pulled away, carrying Elena and her children toward an uncertain future, Marcus stood in his driveway, feeling both heartbroken and strangely at peace. He had lost the battle to protect the family who had come to mean so much to him, but he had won something else. He had discovered who he really was when everything he thought he cared about was put at risk. The aftermath was swift and predictable. Within a week, Marcus received notification that his veterinary license was under review by the state board. Several of his longtime clients canceled their contracts, citing concerns about his legal troubles. The local bank, where he had maintained accounts for 15 years, suggested he might want to consider banking elsewhere. But there were also unexpected developments. Janet Morrison organized a group of community members who supported Marcus's actions. They called themselves the Cedar Valley Compassion Coalition, and they began advocating for immigration reform and humane treatment of refugees and asylum seekers. Sarah Mitchell, the elementary school teacher, started a fund to help cover Marcus's legal expenses. It began with a small donation from her own modest salary, but word spread through social media and eventually raised enough money to hire a competent immigration attorney. Most surprisingly, Marcus received a call from a journalist at the state newspaper who wanted to tell Elena's story. The resulting article, titled A Family's Flight and a Farmer's Choice, brought national attention to Marcus's case and to the broader issues of immigration enforcement and community responsibility. The publicity brought both support and criticism from across the country, but it also brought something Marcus hadn't expected: news about Elena and her children. The immigration attorney, funded by Sarah's crowdsourcing campaign, had been working on Elena's case and discovered that she and her children might qualify for asylum based on the violence they had fled in Phoenix. Furthermore, Roberto's murder and Elena's testimony could be valuable to federal prosecutors building a case against the drug organization responsible. 6 months after that terrible morning when the federal agents came to his farm, Marcus received a phone call that changed everything. Mr. Thompson, came a familiar voice. This is Elena Morales. Marcus's heart leaped. Elena, how are you? How are the children? We're okay, Elena said, her voice thick with emotion. Marcus, we're coming home. Home. The attorney you helped us get worked with federal prosecutors. They want my testimony in exchange for asylum. All of us. We're going to be able to stay. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face. That's wonderful news. Marcus, there's something else. The publicity from your case, from that newspaper article, it's helped other people too. There's a family in Texas whose community rallied around them after reading our story. And a church in Colorado started a refugee assistance program. Marcus was quiet, absorbing the implications of what Elena was telling him. Your choice to help us, Elena continued, it started something bigger than just our family. You showed people that it's possible to choose compassion over fear. When are you coming back? Marcus asked. Next week, if you'll have us. Marcus looked around his house, which had felt empty and quiet for months. He thought about the sound of children's laughter, about Elena's cooking filling the kitchen with warmth, about Miguel's questions about animal care, and Carmen's plans for the garden. Elena, he said, you never left. This is your home. After he hung up the phone, Marcus walked out to his front porch and looked across his 50 acres of rolling hills. The land was the same as it had always been, but everything else had changed. His community had split into factions, some supporting his choice and others condemning it. His comfortable life had been disrupted, his reputation tarnished in some circles and elevated in others. But Marcus realized that he was happier than he had ever been. For the first time in his life, he truly understood what his grandfather had meant about the measure of a man being what he was willing to give up for others who had less. He had given up his quiet, uncomplicated existence, but he had gained something immeasurably more valuable: the knowledge that when faced with a choice between his own comfort and another family's survival, he had chosen correctly. The pickup truck that came up his driveway the following week carried more than just Elena and her 7 children. It carried the proof that one person's decision to do the right thing, regardless of the cost, could indeed change more than just their own life. As Marcus watched Sophia run toward him across the yard, her face bright with joy at being back on the farm she now called home, he realized that the discovery he had made in his barn that cold October morning had led to the greatest discovery of his life. The person he was truly capable of being when everything he thought mattered was put to the test. The town of Cedar Valley had been shocked by Marcus's choice to harbor strangers in need, but that shock had rippled outward in ways that continued to change lives far beyond the borders of one small farming community. And it all began with a veterinarian who heard unusual sounds in his barn and chose compassion over caution.